comment on Chapter 30 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. So this is really an interesting, important chapter. I can't even... There's so much in here, I'm really not going to get to all that much of it, just the stuff that stands out for me in particular. You could spend hours on this chapter. But let me start with a really great quote. There's an adage that nothing disturbs a bishop quite so much as the presence of a saint in the parish. It was one of Pheadrus's favorites. That line really addresses a lot of what's going on in this chapter, the relationship of static and dynamic, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony, and ways to understand both those states and what they mean to each other. This chapter is really on the side of dynamic quality, I think, and it does it in terms of Pirsig's own sense of freedom from static patterns, which he's thinking about, or Pheadrus's at least. He's thinking about freedom from static patterns. He's thinking about Lila's insanity, and also a pursuit of arete, like in the last book, but this time the word itself. And what this chapter really does is emphasize the overarching importance of dynamic quality and how ultimately it is at the top of the moral hierarchy, because it is what allows things to improve. It's the whole driving force of improvement. However, it gets completely pushed aside by a materialistic worldview, which won't even acknowledge its existence or says that it's epiphenomenal. And that worldview, of course, puts at the top of the hierarchy what seems logical and reasonable. Never mind that the whole concept of hierarchy and choosing things, valuing things, wouldn't even exist. That is, if it wasn't for dynamic quality. That's dynamic quality in action, making those value judgments. So here's a quote that illustrates that concept through the moral lens of the metaphysics of quality. The metaphysics of quality says that it is immoral for sane people to force cultural conformity by suppressing the dynamic drives that produce insanity. Such suppression is a lower form of evolution trying to devour a higher one, and that sums up the attitude, I think, in this chapter to a large extent. So this chapter opens with a great metaphor of the old, bleached, irrelevant litter on the beach and the debris slowly receding, and the dynamic natural beauty beginning to emerge and guide him towards this clean and easy path into town. And this metaphor illustrates much of what this book is trying to convey in terms of beauty and elegance emerging out of dead old patterns, at least one of the concepts in this book. So if these dead old patterns can be allowed to update, this is kind of a metaphor of it, then nature comes back. You know, when you've got all this debris and this litter of civilization, it becomes irrelevant. It's just trash. That trash can be broken down by biological patterns, which, when they emerge in their natural beauty again. So it illustrates that sometimes a lower level has been so repressed and corrupted that when that higher level breaks down and ceases to have an influence on the lower thrives again. So he's got to contend with his religious zealot, Lila, who is following a religion of one, where the sacred doll is the totem of the promised land, the island, where all Lila's disappointments will be reconciled, where her beloved Rigel will be, where her dog will be, where she can bury her baby. Or I propose that the baby will come back to life. Pheadrus doesn't think so, but that's my intuition. And then she can be whole. And Lila, in her insanity, has spontaneously and dynamically evoked not a high-quality cure to her burden, but a cure nonetheless. This fantasy, this insane fantasy is the antidote to what she's been suffering from in her life. So I've been listening to Jonathan Pageau a lot lately, and one thing that's important in his work that applies here is that entities such as, say, Santa Claus actually do exist, and we will act as though they exist. Because a child writes a letter to Santa Claus, and it will be answered by the parent, but that parent takes on the spirit of Santa Claus in reality and delivers the toys like Santa Claus. So the entity itself is real. And in the case of Lila, this doll is a real baby. It exists in Lila's reality and serves a purpose for Lila of being an idol to her religious of one. And religions typically depict a worldview heading towards an ideal reality. That is an aspect of most organized religions. In Lila's case, it's the island, and the idol, the doll, represents that ideal reality whose happiness and meaning have been denied to her up to now. So here's a really good quote. The metaphysics of quality identifies religious mysticism with dynamic quality. It says the subject-object people are almost right when they identify religious mysticism with insanity. The two are almost the same. Both lunatics and mystics have freed themselves from the conventional static intellectual patterns of their culture. The only difference is that the lunatic has shifted over to a private static pattern of his own, whereas the mystic has abandoned all static patterns in favor of pure dynamic quality. So maybe you could say mysticism is high quality and lunacy low quality because one goes towards dynamic quality and the other kind of stops and creates a cultural immune system, let's say, that regresses into a lower quality pattern or set of patterns that's not generalizable to live existence. Remember the highest quality patterns, remember back to Poincaré, the highest quality patterns are the ones that work in the most situations that are most generalizable. How productive ultimately is it for Lila to continue to believe in the baby, the island? But it's Pheadrus's hope that she will go through this delusion, this personal delusion, and come out of it with these personal, with these patterns, this delusion dissolved and shaken. And this is why the complete shutdown, the pulling into herself in the last chapter or the last couple of chapters, into her inner world was so upsetting to Pheadrus. I mean, remember, he knows all about insanity, so he's very sensitive to this stuff. But more upsetting to him was the prospect of conventional social reality being forced on her by the institution, by psychiatry, and her either being persuaded by therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy will certainly, try to put your thinking back into the socially acceptable thinking. Not that the cognitive behavioral therapy is bad; it's a great tool. If you, because sometimes you do need to get back on that bandwagon. Sometimes these patterns are good in terms of functioning, and he talks about this in this chapter. But for someone like Lila, why he just doesn't like the idea of her being pushed into conventional social reality. I mean, that's been bad enough for her anyway. This is an oppressive force for her. So, and of course she'd be medicated, which I may or may not be a good thing. I don't know. So he would rather see her go through her lunacy, and that might lead to this mystical state. And who knows better than Pheadrus, whose own psychiatric breakdown was exactly that. It was lunacy into mysticism, or mysticism into lunacy. They were very entwined. But ultimately, he came out of his craziness with these two great books. I mean, these are the outcome of his lunacy. So somehow he worked through it, and he's hoping Lila will do the same in her own way. The metaphysics of quality says as long as the psychiatric approach is encased within a subject-object metaphysical understanding, it will always seek a patterned solution to insanity, never a mystic one. Modern psychology cannot distinguish between a patterned reality and an unpatterned reality, and thus cannot distinguish lunatics from mystics. They seem to be the same. So in terms of the lens that subject-object removes, this applies to all areas in materialism, where value is kind of taken out of the picture. These epiphenomenal human responses that are subjective are taken out. It says that these things don't exist. And if they don't exist, they don't flavor the lens, let's say. So you're not going to be able to tell the difference between mysticism and insanity if that factor isn't in there. And mysticism and insanity look the same to a materialist understanding. But and they're kind of irrelevant, epiphenomenal again. But the metaphysics quality is interesting in this regard because, again, you bring back in that lens of value, that moral lens. And, of course, the moral lens of the conflict of levels. And this shows how the metaphysics quality can really enhance understanding of mysteries of human understanding, religious understanding. And religious understanding to a materialist just seems like weird superstition and primitive. But listen to what he says here through the metaphysics quality lens. When one looks through the record of our culture for connections between insane understanding, religious understanding, one soon finds them everywhere. Even the idea of insanity as possession by the devil can be explained by the metaphysics of quality as a lower biological pattern, the devil trying to overcome a higher pattern of conformity to cultural belief. And really, when you think about that, it's very Pageauian as well, in a lot of regards. The devil being symbolic of lower order fragmentation, perhaps, but lower order biological quality possessing you, so you want to do all those things. The devil made me do it. So Pheadrus feels the patterned approach, again, getting Lila to conform in some way to social patterns would be immoral because it would prevent her from going through her insanity to that dynamic state of not knowing, of pure experience, and that would allow her to recreate patterns that would work better for her rather than forcing these societal patterns that have never worked for her anyway. And the approach is starting actually to gain acceptance in the psychiatric community in the case of psychedelics. I wonder what, when Pirsig wrote this was, like I said, I mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy because that was the prevailing approach at that time. The more dynamic psychoanalysis had kind of been discredited as too subjective. So I wonder what Pirsig would say about psychedelics being front and center of treatment. These are being really, really right out there as a potential treatment these days. This solution is to dissolve all static patterns, both sane and insane, and find the base of reality, dynamic quality that is independent of all of them. It's exactly what psychedelics do in the best case scenarios, and shock therapy too, by the way, as Pirsig mentions. These methods destroy old patterns so we can see the world new and fresh, and that's why psychedelic treatment also often resolves both addictions and PTSD. Lila has both to some extent. And Lila has this worldview based on the enforcement of pathological social, say her mother and her husband, patterns, and biological patterns, say her tendency towards delusion, which might be a organic thing, probably is. Upon this innocent, pure psyche, that sweet Rigel, that sweet Lila that Rigel remembers, this new, fresh, childlike state that has been so corrupted by these pathological patterns. That innocent psyche can take these patterns as reality because they are, and so then the psyche will either conform to them or fight them. Lila has a tendency to fight them, probably temperamental. She's always fighting enemies. And but sometimes she finds too much good in people. She has, kind of black and white thinking. She doesn't have a way of seeing people in a way that works, in a way that really brings in all the nuance of relationships. What Pheadrus wants is for these old projections she's got and these old traumatic encounters with people, these residual, these inner objects based on these traumatic encounters with people, to be dissolved so Lila can live her life on her own terms and not constantly fighting these ghosts and like running away from how society is for her and through low-level biological comforts, booze and too much sex with the wrong people, etc. Avoiding any kind of consistency, any kind of ritual, because these rituals have not served her well, these social rituals. So maybe she can find her own rituals, he hopes, on her own terms that can get her through life, let's say. Who knows what those are going to be. So to allow her to go through this, Pheadrus thinks she needs some alone time, which he gives her, and she needs to cycle through whatever it is in sort of monastic sequestering. So perhaps maybe the voice of God or the good can speak to her, and she can elegantly emerge from all this debris, like the red sumac that emerges at the end of Pheadrus's slog through the beach trash. What she has to do is take a vacation from all patterns, old and new, and just settle into a kind of emptiness for a while. And if she does, the culture has a moral obligation not to bother her. The most moral activity of all is the creation of space for life to move onward. So maybe we all ought to think about that in a number of cases. I mean, maybe sometimes we just need to leave people alone to do their own thing and not meddle. It's a very hard thing to do, especially with people who are close to us, but sometimes it's the best thing. Like Jordan Peterson says, don't try to help someone who doesn't ask you for it. This chapter contains what I think is one of the most interesting passages in the book. And it also kind of occurs more or less in the same place as the book as the whole arete thing occurred in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance right towards the end. It's a resolution. In this case, he's looking for the origin of the word arete rather than arete itself, which he already knows about. And he goes through the earliest of languages, which is Proto-Indo-European, and here's a diagram. And if you looked at the Mike Hill, Robert Breedlove primer on I guess you would call it, on metaphysics quality, they show this diagram. It's really cool. I mean, the whole thing about Proto-Indo-European is fascinating and probably worth more of a dive. So he finds this word, RT, which seems to be the basis of the word arete, which has sort of the implication of being ritual. Ritual suggested repetitive order, and the word has two meanings, right-handed and moral, and aesthetic correctness. When all these meanings were strung together, a fuller picture of morphine emerged, or it referred to the first created beautiful repetitive order of moral and aesthetic correctness. Interestingly, in the sciences today, arithmetic still enjoys that status. So there's something about this. I guess you could say this is logos. And I want to talk about that in just a second. It's when human consciousness first sees patterns. And that's the beginning of static quality. So there is sort of a static understanding of this particular word. And there's something in the section that shows the evolution of the word rita, which is what he discovers is an earlier form of this. And over time, it became associated with more static interpretations, ritual, right-handedness, arithmetic, which kind of bums Pheadrus out. But the original interpretation, that's the RT interpretation, but the original interpretation is closer to Proto-Indo-European, it's the Sanskrit word, and it's much closer to the metaphysical origin. And it is a word that more adequately describes what Pheadrus was hoping it would. The physical order of the universe is also the moral order of the universe. Rita is both. This is exactly what the metaphysics of quality was claiming. It was not a new idea. It was the oldest idea known to man. And this also illustrates what Pirsig means by mythos gives birth to logos. The mythos are myths and legends, or the general way of seeing reality updates. And we've seen this especially in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But implied here, too, that something like Rita, the concept of the way of static and dynamic together in harmony, turns into RT, which is more static. And ultimately, it's arithmetic that ends up being held in the highest regard in human consciousness, at least in the West. I mean, this is, math is probably considered the purest and highest good in terms of rationality, I guess you could say. So this is the way of quality analogs evolving, no doubt. But like Jordan Peterson says, in his view of truth, a small diversion from truth, from that harmony, it results in hamartia, or an early lie, the lie that the ritual was better than the more holistic version of the word, where you start, where humanity starts realizing that going in this direction is going to, let's just say, allow them to survive longer. This little diversion, the little lie, yields a huge divergence later. And this section is another description of how we lost the harmony of the dynamic, how we got rid of the dynamic and ultimately ended up where we are now. So it's another way of looking at this. It's another way of looking at what he looked at earlier in chapter 29 of Zen, the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where the lie was that truth was more important than quality. So let me read that quote again. The physical order of the universe is also the moral order of the universe. Rita is both. This was exactly what the metaphysics of quality was claiming. It was not a new idea. It was the oldest idea known to man. Matter must be in productive tension with spirit. It's not a life or death conflict. They must work together. That's the oldest idea in the universe. It's in Peugeot's spirit and matter. It's in the mediating factor, us, let's just say, or the mediating factor between heaven and earth is how the universe is created. And that brings up a really interesting notion. Perhaps physics and metaphysics are indelibly linked. Perhaps they are one, spirit and matter. And since we've stripped out the lens of spirit, of value from physics, and since modern materialistic sensibility relegates value to a lesser realm or explains it away with things like evolutionary biology and neuroscience and epiphenomenal and emergence, then there's no lens in which to step outside of physics and see it any other way other than increasingly smaller particles. It also always has to be physical because we've stripped out the metaphysics, and yet the metaphysics and the physics and in ancient times were indelibly linked, and it's a real, we might be getting to the, in another way, the basis of the problems we're seeing today. So in modern materialistic sensibility, this is the final outcome of those very first divergences away from rita, and what it became, arithmetic. That tracing back to the truth-good separation in Plato seems to have been happening in human consciousness in general. And like I said, maybe, survival instincts. I mean, it was the way biology was finally conquered, but it came at quite a price. Also, Pheadrus talks about rituals that work and rituals that don't. And even practitioners of religion know, in this day and age, complain about in this day and age that organized religion has been reduced to less and less meaningful rituals, like those Victorian overwrought curlicues that weren't reflections of nature, but were recursive, were self-reflections, let's say, were in their own little immune system, where they became more and more elaborate and less reflections of the original stimulus, which was in nature. Rituals elaborate and pompous, or sometimes too spare, are far removed from the original purpose of what rituals were, which was communicating with gods, of mediating between heaven and earth. So there's rituals that allow the gods to look favorably upon you, sacrifices you make for freedom, like one example he gives is showing up for work, have far more meaning than worshiping, let's say, like Nietzsche said, the shadow of the Buddha on the cave wall, or this reduced and winnowed down nice hippie Jesus that some of these more secular churches, I guess you could say, promote. So until we get back to some kind of religious ritual that guides us into how to mediate between heaven and earth in a way that really works, in a way that keeps things in harmony, a lot of modern religion can be seen in the same level of other social conventions, which of course it became in the 19th century and probably earlier. In the West, progress seems to proceed by a series of spasms of alternating freedom and ritual. A revolution of freedom against old rituals produces a new order, which soon becomes another old ritual for the next generation to revolt against, on and on. In the Orient, there are plenty of conflicts, but historically this particular kind of conflict has not been dominant. Pheadrus thought it was because Dharma includes both static and dynamic quality without contradiction, and that's what we're talking about, that harmonious state that maybe we're trying to find again. So maybe that's why people are trying to find and rediscover religious patterns that do mediate between heaven and earth. Pheadrus has found it in his orthodoxy, which is as close to the source of Christianity as any form. It's the closest, let's say. So it comes directly from, so it is not so lost through this, being so, it's closer to the source, let's say. And that is, according to Pheadrus and to Jeremy, who I just talked to, the Orthodox rituals seem to evoke a reconnecting with God in a real way, in a dynamic way preserved by the static pattern, versus singing about a dreamy blonde Jesus. And so also rituals like Tai Chi, which puts you in contact with Tao, say, and that's what John Vervaeke is pursuing. Of course, Pirsig is partial to the more Eastern approach, but emphasizes the ritual part, kind of like motorcycle maintenance. It's a ritual, as good static patterns that work with dynamic quality, preserving our freedom by fixing what works to preserve our freedom by doing this, just that, and yet these patterns allow for updates. So an interesting point he makes in here is that Zen monks have integrated strict ritual to the point that it's so second nature you don't even think about it. And that is certainly one way to mediate between heaven and earth. I guess it depends on what mythos you were born into. So at the end of the chapter, the southern wind was stronger here, and it cooled him. It was steady like a trade wind. Nothing interfered with its flow toward him over the huge ocean. Vast emptiness and nothing sacred. If ever there was a visible concrete metaphor, dynamic quality, this was it. Now, doesn't that sound like God's breath over the chaotic waters in Genesis before there was any separation? I think it does. So Pheadrus ends this chapter, not ends this chapter, but in general in this chapter, Pheadrus is conflicted. He wants freedom from Lila, for her to just go away, and it's also nagging at him to help her organize her life, which he's trying to work out intellectually, so you just can't get away from it, and sometimes. So we'll see how this goes. I hope that makes sense, and I will see you next time.